Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies Tier List video. Today, our analyst will be ranking each synergy from S down to C tier. This is the first tier list of the mid-season update, so expect a lot of changes in future patches as we're still exploring and learning. The current meta is also quite diverse, so the differences between each tier may not be that much as every trait is viable in the right situation. With that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright folks, let's get back to the video, and to kick things off, we've got S tier, which consists of Vanguard, Mystic, Sorcerer, and Astro. S tier is all about the synergies that you will most often see place high in games or have a large impact on the meta. First up, we've got Vanguard. This trait goes hand in hand with Mystic, as these two traits are currently shaping the meta more than any other. Vanguard provides an incredible frontline for most compositions throughout the game, but are particularly hard to deal with when combined with Mystic. In addition to receiving buffs to 4 Vanguard and 10-12, the newly added champion Nautilus brings even more CC options to the trait. This makes it so you can run Nautilus and Wukong as a pair to provide a ton of crowd control. Mix in with these two Mordekaiser and Jace, and now you have a hard-to-kill frontline with strong CC and good AoE damage. Mystic is the other synergy currently defining the meta, as the pairing of magic resist and armor with Vanguard makes for a formidable combination. Mystic received large buffs in the mid-season update, but arguably one of the largest changes was the introduction of Cassiopeia, who can serve as an actual carry for the trait. Prior to Cassiopeia, there really wasn't any damage-dealing carries for Mystic, so it was often hard to run 4 Mystic as you'd be lacking too much damage. But once you get Cassiopeia and give her a blue buff, Morellonomicon, and Rapid Fire Cannon, she becomes a monstrous carry backed by a hard-to-kill frontline and can't be burst down by magic damage thanks to Mystics. There's also now 5 Mystics, making it possible to run 4 prior to finding Lulu, which makes the trait even more flexible. Speaking of magic damage, the next trait to talk about is Sorcerer. Sorcerers may struggle a bit with 4 Mystic, but against every other trait they do quite well. With Victor being added in, there's now multiple Sorcerers that can serve as carries, and he helps alleviate the reliance on Xerath as the only late-game carry for the trait. Alongside Victor, there's also a 5% buff to 4 Sorcerer, making it more reliable in the mid-game. Overall, there are a lot of ways to play against Sorcerer, but the prevalence of the trait in the current meta makes it S tier. You can play Sorcerer with Riven, Mech, Gangplank, and several other variations, making it a flexible synergy in the current meta. The last S tier trait is Astro. Astro is a newly added trait with the mid-season update, and it's made a huge splash in the meta as all of the champions can be useful in multiple ways. One of the main reasons as to why this trait is doing so well is the versatility of Gnar and Nautilus. These two champions complement one another so well in the front line, as they both provide a good amount of crowd control. While the Astro trait doesn't impact the rest of your team in the same way that Mystic or Sorcerer does, it does make it so your CC frontline casts earlier, which is hugely beneficial, especially for Gnar. Alongside those two champions, you have Teemo, who has a unique form of crowd control with the slowing mushrooms and does high amounts of damage, especially when paired with other snipers. All in all, this trait is fast becoming a key aspect of the current and future metas. Let's move on to the A tier synergies, which consist of Cybernetic, Chrono, Sniper, Brawler, Mech-Pilot, Blademaster, and Rebel. A tier represents traits that are doing above average in the current meta, and while they don't shape the meta in the same way as the S tier traits, they are still an essential part of it. Cybernetics are up first at the top of A tier, as they've received significant changes with the mid-season update. These changes are mainly the addition of Vayne and the rework to Echo. Vayne is a solid backline carry in the mid-game with the potential to carry late-game, as well as making it so that you can run 6 Cybernetics without Echo. By having the option to run 6 Cybernetics earlier on in the game, you can stabilize earlier, making the transition into the late game much smoother. Echo is now a legitimate late game threat with his changes, which now means Cybernetics have 3 potential carries with Vayne, Aurelia, and now Echo. The main downside for this trait is how common it is for multiple players to contest it, making it overall harder for players to find the necessary champions and upgrades. There is also a reliance on making Last Whisper, as both Vayne and Aurelia need it to counter Vanguard. Next up, we have Chrono. Chrono is still going strong as the best splash trait in the game. It has extremely flexible champions, which makes playing 2 Chrono possible in basically every single comp you can play. Sniper has found its place in the meta now that there's 2 new champions added to it. Prior to the mid-season update, the largest issue issue with the trait was how inflexible it was and how heavily it relied on Jin as the carry. Now with Teemo and Vayne being added, you have more carry options as well as the ability to run 4 snipers. The main downside to sniper right now is the prevalence of 4 Vanguard, making it hard to run Vayne or Jin as the main carry without Last Whisper. Teemo also struggles against 4 Mystic, but overall this trait is one of the better carry options in the current meta. Next up, we have Brawler, which is still doing well as a frontline option, but has certainly taken a backseat to Vanguard. Gnar being added has given the trait a more reliable form of CC that Cho'Gath wasn't bringing, so it's not uncommon to see Gnar played with his second Brawler. 4 Brawler is still a viable option, but nowhere near as common as it was in the past. The big reason for Brawler's prominence in the meta is how easy it is to fit 2 Brawlers into quite a few compositions, alongside Gnar being one of the top champions. Mech-Pilot has had a bumpy ride so far in 10-12, but it did receive significant buffs to the Super Mech, which has helped keep this trait relevant. One of the main reasons as to why it's up in A tier is how well and easy it goes along with sorcerers. It may not be as dominant as it was in the previous metas, but overall Mech-Pilot is still an important part of the meta. Unfortunately, Blademaster lost its most important carry in the update, Kale, but it has managed to find a place in the meta with the return of Slash Bros. It's also one of the more common traits to use a spatula for, as Blademaster Zed or Blademaster Vayne can do a lot of work in their respective compositions. Lastly, for A tier, we have Rebels. Rebels have found a new life in 10-12 as Jinx still remains a popular hard carry and Aurelion Sol receives significant buffs, making him an actual late game threat. The early game is also more flexible now with the addition of Zed, as the damage he provides is much more consistent than the small amount of healing that Sona used to do. Overall, this trait is not as important as its champions, but it is doing well nonetheless. Moving down the list, we've arrived at the B tier, which consists of Protector, Celestial, Mana Reaver, Infiltrator, Starship, Blaster, and Dark Star. These synergies are average in strength and often have secondary roles in the meta. Up first, we have Protector. Protector easily could have been near the top of A tier or even S tier at the beginning of 10-12, but a hotfix lowered them down to the top of B tier. They are still powerful, especially with Warmogs, but they aren't as dominating as they were before the hotfix. Celestial has fallen down in the rankings as losing Kassadin really hurt the flexibility of the trait. It's still incredibly useful to splash in, as the healing is beneficial to a lot of compositions, but just overall much harder to fit into builds with one fewer champion. Another trait suffering from the loss of Kassadin is Mana Reaver. Much like Celestial, Mana Reaver is still powerful when utilized, but it's just so much harder to make work in any build that isn't Cybernetics. It's awkward to pair Thresh with Darius or Aurelia in the majority of compositions, which makes it difficult to run Mana Reaver. Kassadin's presence is certainly being missed. Moving on, we've got Infiltrator up next, which is the epitome of average in the current meta. It can do well, and it's still common to see played in several compositions, but the trait itself doesn't matter as much as it used to. The nerf that made it possible for backline champions to turn on Infiltrators has really been felt now that there's been a couple of patches for players to get used to it. Finally, Starship, or Aurelion Sol, has made it out of the D tier. Aurelion received several buffs in 10-12, in particular adding mana drain to his fighters that made him a viable late game champion. He's still hard to fit into a majority of compositions, but he can actually do something now compared to how he previously was. Blaster has fallen down quite far in the meta because players have realized 4 Blaster is just not that useful anymore. While Jinx is still a popular carry and pairing her with another Blaster is common, she doesn't need the trait the way that she used to, especially with her rockets no longer working with it. Misfortune being gone also lessens the late game value of Blaster. In general, running early game Blaster or pairing one with Jinx is all you're really going to see from this trait. For the last trait in B tier, we have Dark Star. Dark Star is actually way better in 10-12 now that you can splash it in easier and have the trait's effect proc off of any allied champion dying. But it also doesn't have as big of an impact or reliance as it used to, making it severely average. It's certainly not a bad trait, but it's also not that important. And now we've reached C tier, which is the last synergy tier for this week, as there's no D tier. This tier consists of Mercenary, Battlecast, Star Guardian, Paragon, Space Pirate, and Demolitionist. Overall, these are below average traits that can be useful in certain situations, but aren't essential in most games. Mercenary can still be useful for Gangplank, as upgrades on him are important, but it's now just him and there's no other champions. Arguably one of his best upgrades, increased area on his ability, was also nerfed, making Mercenary overall not as essential for him as it once once was. Next, we have Battlecast, one of the new traits added in the mid-season update. Despite having the best and most meta-defining champion Urgot, this trait overall doesn't provide much beyond the early stages of the game. The damage or healing can be useful, but it's in too small of numbers to make much of an impact on the mid and late game. Sorcerers are still outshining Star Guardian, which is why the trait is struggling. Most of the champions are sorcerers, so while it'll be common to have Star Guardian with sorcerer builds, the fact is the ability power buff matters much more than the mana return. It's not a bad synergy, it's just overshadowed by a better one. Another new trait added in 10.12 is Paragon. Paragon comes with Janna, who is a fantastic late game champion with her CC and attack speed buff. But the trait she comes with, Paragon, is just too niche currently. You're better off keeping her on your bench and pulling her in with Thresh than you are actually playing her for the Paragon trait. Next, we have Space Pirate. Space Pirates are the same as always, decent early game with strong mid to late game champions. But the synergy itself is still struggling to find a use in the mid and late game, even though Jace and Gangplank are great. And the last trait we have for today is Demolitionist. Demolitionist is still incredibly useful when paired with the Super Mech or Gangplank, but it's much harder to play now that the Demolitionist charge item has been removed. Don't be dissuaded from running this trait when necessary, but it really has become far too niche without the spatula item. That's all that we've got for today's tier list video. The mid-season update has done a great job in shaking up the meta. Let us know in the comment section below what synergies you've been enjoying in the current meta and which ones you think may need balancing in the next patch. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.